My name is Niklaus Largier. I'm actually the only one, I think, who is at Berkeley at this time, lucky enough. I'd like to welcome everybody who is joining us there. I think it's roughly 20 people, and I'd like to thank the panelists for being here. Can everybody hear me? Just nod quickly. Yes, I'd also like to thank once again Maureen Miller, Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe for organizing this program. Obviously, everything now in this new format. Also thanking the MAA, the Medieval Academy, Ruth, Lisa for making this possible in this format. And the panelists, I'll introduce them individually when they speak. I also posted my email address here, and since the chat functions are not open for auditors, I would like to ask you, if you have questions, to send them to me. I'll do my best then to read them out after the papers. So please just send questions by email and indicate who the question is for. I think that's all the information for now. So my pleasure now first to introduce Mark Zier, I think known to all of you who deal with Eriugena. Mark Zier is a student of Leonard Boyle and Edouard Journeau. He has published critical editions, as you know, of Andrew of St. Victor's Expositio Super Danielum and Expositio Super Prophetas. He assisted Edouard Journeau in the publication of the critical edition of Periphyseon 4, and his edition of Periphyseon 5, volume 5, was published in 2003. So Mark will speak about the twists and turns in Eriugena's path as translator of the Pseudo-Dionysius. So Mark, welcome. You have to unmute yourself. Yes, there you are.
There are about 3 different places where you can hit the buttons, you know.
Yes. Do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, I do.
Then I will stop sharing the email address. Please write it down for you in case you have questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen and Mark can share his.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I couldn't resist as I was thinking about visuals for this. I couldn't resist putting on the opening screen this image of Eriugena that found its way onto the €5 note in Ireland in years past. I don't believe you can find him there anymore, but he was there at one point. There's quite a story behind that. And I don't know if any of the rest of you want to tell it. I know that it's humorous, and we might get to that later on. The years between 850, when his treatise on predestination was published, and the mid-860s, when he completed Periphyseon, mark an intense period of translation of Greek texts for John Scotus Eriugena, who by all accounts was ambitious, audacious, and brilliant. His translations became integral to his project in Periphyseon, which was to describe from both the book of nature and the book of scripture the exitus of all things from God and the reditus of all things back to God. While many of the basic principles of his metaphysics were firmly in place, even by the time he wrote his treatise on predestination, his translations of Pseudo-Dionysius, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus the Confessor, who commented on Gregory Nazianzen, gave him the tools and perspective to elaborate and deepen his views. And in his magnum opus, Periphyseon, he quotes extensively from his translations of those Greek authors. The first text he was given in this regard was the collected works of the Pseudo-Dionysius, a manuscript of which had been given to the Frankish king by the Byzantine emperor in 827. First translated to Latin by the abbot of the royal abbey of Saint-Denis, the task was given to Eriugena to produce a new translation which he presented to Charles the Bald in 860. This Greek manuscript presented many challenges to the Irishman, whose Greek, by his own admission, was quite rudimentary as he began his task. Over the course of the rest of his life, he was constantly revising his work. Many have written about how Eriugena came to his knowledge of Greek. He knew a little, well, he knew quite a bit, even before he started writing his treatise on predestination. But this was quite a challenge to him, given to him by Charles the Bald. Eriugena tells us in the preface to the Pseudo-Dionysius, which his translation of Dionysius is called, that as he set about his task, he translated the Greek word for word, exactly as he found it in his manuscript. Anyone who has compared Eriugena's Latin to the original Greek will recognize this pattern instantly, and that John Scotus did exactly what he set out to do. This pattern was not lost on Anastasius, the papal librarian in the 870s, to whom had been given the task of assessing Eriugena's work when Charles the Bald had sent a copy of it to Rome to the Pope. Anastasius was surprised not so much by Eriugena's approach as by the very fact that this barbarian, as he called him, could translate Greek at all. Now, given the considerable differences in syntax between Greek and Latin, at first blush, Eriugena's Latin translation can seem even more difficult to understand than the Greek text of Dionysius. Now, Dionysius loved his participial phrases, stringing them together one after another. And while in Greek the use of the definite article is a key marker in delineating these participial phrases, there is no such marker in Latin. Let's see, okay. At 920 AB, we find an example that reflects this kind of awkwardness. And here, Eriugena is quoting the fifth letter of Dionysius. And a literal English translation of the Greek gives the upper version here. The divine cloud is the inaccessible light in which God is said to dwell. While being invisible, et invisibili existente, owing to the excess of its brightness, and the very same, existing inaccessible on account of the super excellence of its super essential radiation of light. It's a somewhat awkward construction, and what we find is that Eriugena will eventually revise his translation, and what we find as it is quoted in Periphyseon is as we find it in the second translation, in the second version. On the way to Periphyseon, et invisibili existente becomes dum invisibilis existet, and then the phrase inaccessibili eodem per super excellentiam is translated into the pair is dropped, the reference to the prior participial phrase is dropped, and so you get inaccessibilem super excellentiam. And it smooths out the Latin, makes it a little easier to understand, and it doesn't compromise the reading. Now, you can see this in the manuscript T, called T. It's from Troyes, that Dandin had suggested was or had concluded, I should say, was the corrected version of Eriugena's translations of Dionysius. Now, you can see in the very first line up here, this phrase, et invisibili existente. Now, what happens is that Eriugena, in this first blush, well, in this version, hadn't paid any attention to post-positive get in the Greek, which turns the et into a dum. But eventually he caught on to that, and so that's why we get it in the Periphyseon version of this text. You can see here, it's not as easy with these little boxes on the side, but there are a number of participial phrases here that are that carry forward the whole discussion. And he translates, he modifies most of them into noun phrases in Periphyseon. In the Corpus Anastasianum, in this manuscript from Berlin, we can see what's so interesting about this particular manuscript is that while we get this final version in the Troyes manuscript, here in this version, which is roughly about the same time, maybe a little later, 900, we have not only Anastasius's commentary in the margin, but we have a number of interlinear insertions. And if you look carefully here, you can see that what they represent are not glosses, but rather the alternative version or the alternative translation that eventually wind up, or something like them, wind up in. So here we have that phrase, et invisibilium, unfortunately it's not quite invisibilis, existente, has been changed, or it's been suggested in between the lines, dum existat invisibilem. Close, not quite to what we get in Periphyseon, but it's moving in that direction. You can see down here also, non videndo is a phrase that gets translated into dum non videt in Periphyseon. It would be nice to be able to say that we could see this here, be able to read this, but well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Of all the works of Dionysius, the only one on which Eriugena wrote a commentary was the Celestial Hierarchy. And this gives us the opportunity to discover just what Eriugena was thinking as he translated, especially when he came up against what was, as we know now, an error in his manuscript. In chapter 4 of the Celestial Hierarchy, Dionysius speaks of how the being of all things have their being from God. And as he comes to the end of his argument, he punctuates his point by saying, even all inanimate things, azoa, share in God's being. Now, Eriugena's manuscript gave zoa for azoa. In other words, the complete opposite. Not living thing, not inanimate things, but animate things, living things. This gave Eriugena quite a bit of consternation, and he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. In the end, he opted for translating it with the same word that he used to translate the Greek word onta, existentia. Now, the fourth chapter here this is a page that is rather damaged, as obviously, but this is where the fourth chapter of his commentary on, the translation of his commentary on the Celestial Hierarchy begins with the dark text over here. And up here, if you squint real hard, you can see the word existentia in the second line here, showing that this was the word that he came up with in the end to translate Zoa. But if we go to the Berlin manuscript of the Corpus Anastasianum, we find, again, an interesting treatment. Here again, the fourth chapter of the hierarchy, Celestial Hierarchy. And if you look down in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see that that original Zoa is translated here, animalia, and is given an alternative reading, aliter existentia. So one of the great things about this version of Eriugena's translation that we find in this Berlin manuscript is that it essentially is giving us both the early and the later version of his translation of Dionysius. There is, of course, in the PL a version of it, but that version is more a reflection of the state of the text in the 12th century than it was in the 9th century. And so here we have these two manuscripts between Troyes and Berlin. We have some interesting and useful witnesses to the early state of Eriugena's text. Now, I know time is short, so I'd like to move on to something else that actually isn't a translation so much of the Greek sources as how he refers to his Greek authorities. And this has to do with something that happened a long time ago. Kaplans had written that Eriugena had confused Gregory of Nyssa with Gregory of Nazianzen several times in Periphyseon, starting at the end of book 3 and then continuing through books 4 and 5. What makes this so perplexing is that Eriugena had translated works of both these theologians, and he surely knew the difference between them and which one it was that Maximus had commented on. I would argue that this confusion is more apparent than real, especially when you pay close attention to the context. And before we examine the examples of this confusion, it's instructive to get a sense of the role of one particular scribe with respect to this issue, namely Nizifortinus. Nizifortinus is the name that Jono gave to the scribe who wrote in the Irish hand I.2, as it's designated in the apparatus all over the place. He also called him the student that corrected the master, which says something about I2's role in all of this as well. Clearly a member of Eriugena's inner circle, his contributions can be found scattered throughout several manuscripts associated with Eriugena. In the Reims and Bamberg manuscripts of Periphyseon, and importantly for the current discussion, Paris BNF Lat 14088, which is a manuscript from the library of Wulfad, to whom Eriugena had, well, not quite dedicated, but certainly commended Periphyseon. On the flyleaf of this manuscript, there are 4 brief extracts from the Historia Tripartita attributed to Cassiodorus that are written in the hand of I2, Nizifortinus, 2 of which give identifications of persons named Gregory. In one, Gregory Nazianzen is called the brother of Basil of Caesarea. He wasn't, but he was a friend and a spiritual brother, you might say. And then in a second of these identifications, Gregory of Nyssa is correctly described as the brother of Basil. Now, if you were to think that both of these identifications were correct, you would conclude that the 2 Gregorys were in fact the same person. Now, with this in mind, we read in Book 2 of Periphyseon at 586a, the passage quoted here, a discussion of the ability of a created essence to define itself that reveals an interesting correction here made by Nizifortinus, and that's the key here. In the Reims manuscript, we find the following reference to the 2 Gregorys. In this passage, Eriugena is giving his opinion on the matter, and then he concludes that that he doesn't want to go against the 2 Gregorys, lest we should appear impudently to oppose, I'm going to try to get this, oppose Gregory Nazianzen and of Nyssa, whom we have mentioned above, who unanimously declare with sound reason that no created essence can define what it is either by itself or by another, even though endowed with reason and intellect. So clearly in the Reims manuscript, Eriugena is talking about 2 Gregorys, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzen. But in the Bamberg manuscript of the same book, we find these corrections made by I2. So now the text reads, lest we should appear impudently to oppose Gregory Nazianzen, the theologian. So that phrase, and of Nyssa, whom we have mentioned above, has been replaced by theologian, who, and now there's only one person, so it can't be unanimously. So he changes unanimously to undoubtedly and changes the number from plural, declare, to the singular, declares. these changes were introduced by Nicephortinus in keeping, it would seem, with his understanding that the two Gregorys were one and the same. Now, back to Kaplan's examples of the confusion of the two Gregorys in the later books of Periphyseon. In two passages, the two Gregorys are identified as one in a manner not unlike the passage we've just been examining. The first of these occurs towards the end of book 3. The second occurs towards the end of book 4. At the end of book 3, we read this passage, reference, Gregory of Nyssa, who is also called Nazianzen, brother Germain of the aforesaid Basil, in his discourse on the image. And then in book 4, we read the venerable Gregory Nazianzen, who is also called Nicaean, and of his expositor Maximus. Now, you'll note that if you take that bracketed phrase, and now there's nothing in the manuscripts that indicate any changes, okay? No corrections or anything like that. But if you pass over the bracketed phrase, you'll find that everything comes out right. Gregory of Nyssa, what is the author of the discourse on the image, and Gregory Nazianzen was exposited by Maximus. So it almost looks like someone has added in these glosses at a very early stage in the transmission. Now, as you know, especially once you get to book 5, being able to tease these things out of the earlier versions is a little bit trickier. But even here, we find that there doesn't seem to be any variance, but it sure doesn't make much sense. Now, it's interesting to note that in the manuscript J, in the margin, there is a note that precisely identifies the two as the same. Now, moving on to book 5, Kaplan's saw this confusion in a half a dozen places. In 3 of them, Eriugena was, as he was coming to the conclusion of his work, cited De Imagine, attributing it to, well, as you see it, in these 3 places, Magni Gregori Theologi, Magni Quoque Theologi Gregorii, Magnum Quoque Theologum Gregorium. And Kaplan's just decided that these were all references to Gregory Nazianzen. But in fact, in all 3 cases, he's quoting the De Imagine, and on top of that, notice that he's also using the modifier magnum in all 3 cases. If you go back and scroll through the Periphyseon, you'll discover that he never calls Gregory Nazianzen magnum. He'll call him the venerable, he'll call him all kinds of things, all good things, of course, but he never calls him magnum. That's reserved for Gregory of Nyssa. So these aren't really confusions, but there are irreducible, some what appear to be irreducible confusions of the 2 Gregorys in these 2 books, in 4 and 5, at 808a, 812c, and 879c. And here again, there are no indications of any kind of modifications to the text in any of the manuscripts. And we have this linking in all 3 cases, really, of Gregory of Nyssa with Maximus the Confessor, which of course is backwards. It's Gregory of Nazianzen who's connected with Maximus, who commented on him. I've highlighted the 3 phrases here, Nisium Prefati and Magnum Gregorium Niceum, to show just how easy it would be to see that this could have been an emendation made by someone like I.2 who had no hesitation to make emendations to Eriugena's text. So, oops, there we go. After all, it would only take a small change. In the first, could not Nisium have been emended from theologum? And in the second, could not prefati have been emended from Gregorys? Again, the second one, prefati, is referring to whoever was the previous author of the previous quotation, and it happened to be and that happened to be, of course, Nyssa. But obviously, if he's talking about Maximus, Maximus is the expositor of Gregory the theologian. So that's just, it's very, it's very easy to see how the one could become the other. And even in the third, Magnum Gregorium Nicaeum could well have been emended from Gregorium Nazianzenum. Now, as I say, this is pure speculation, but at the same time, it suggests that maybe all of these confusions are not so much on the part of Eriugena, but more on the part of Nisi Fortinus, I.2. The examples of the variations in Eriugena's text that I've described here are not unique, but rather representative of the kind of changes that his work went through over the course of its composition, and even, if you will, beyond its composition into its editorial finishing by some of the circle of Eriugena. Now, Eriugena's evolving understanding of salvation and deification is surely one of the more important thematic developments in Periphyseon, especially in book 5. But at the same time, it seems that Eriugena was always tinkering with his translations from the Greeks, especially those of the Areopagite, whose works were his first and perhaps greatest challenge. And it was not just the author, but it would seem at least one of his students also had a hand in emending the text. The confusion of the two Gregorys is perhaps one of the more obvious, although maybe not one of the most significant contributions that Nisi Fortinus has made in the transmission of Eriugena's magnum opus. Yet it illustrates the dynamic nature of a text that one could argue was always in a state of some flux. Speaking of being in a state of flux and interesting twists and turns, I wanted to end with a cartoon. I don't know if you've seen this cartoon before. It was done by Randall Rosenfeld, a student at the Pontifical Institute some decades ago. And it illustrates a moment from William of Malmesbury, where he speaks of the king and Eriugena sitting at table together. And somehow Eriugena has displeased the king, and the king asks the Scot a question. What is it that, what stands between a Sot and a Scot? What's the difference between a Sot and a Scot? And of course then Eriugena replies, well, only a table. Now, the one character in this that's not in William of Malmesbury is the person in the middle. And he's the student of Eriugena, who's thinking to himself as Eriugena is speaking, nisi forte quis dixerit. And of course, this is the phrase that gives Nisi Fortinus his name. What many might not know or appreciate outside of the circle of Toronto is that when Randall did this, when Randall drew this, he drew Eriugena in the likeness of Edouard Chauneau, and the Nisi Fortinus in the likeness of Paul Dutton, who was probably his most prolific and one of his earliest students. So I wanted to end on that note just to show how dynamic this understanding of Eriugena and the role of his student, Nisi Fortinus, might have been in the production of his works. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Mark, for the presentation. Can you just, unfortunately, we don't have a clap function here. I think that's one of the things that is lacking on Zoom, but symbolically it'd be performed. Could you unshare your screen now or stop
sure.
sharing.
Right.
And I'd like to go then from here directly to the next paper. We'll save questions for the end. Is Dermot Moran. He's the inaugural holder of the Joseph Chair in Catholic Philosophy at Boston College. He was formerly professor of philosophy at University College in Dublin. His publications include, and I just mentioned a few, the philosophy of John Scotus Eriugena in 1989, then Introduction to Phenomenology, which is one of his major fields of research, with a book on Edmund Husserl, founder of phenomenology, the Husserl Dictionary. And I want to mention also the volume co-edited with Stephen Gersh, Eriugena, Berkeley, and the Idealist Tradition. Dermot will speak today about Eriugena on the nature of nothing, Nihil, and the modes of non-being. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
I can.
I'm showing you the slides in this format. Thank you. After such an erudite discussion of the modes of composition of the Periphyseon, I feel I'm probably on a much lighter note, although I'm also talking about a very complex issue, namely Eriugena's concept of nothing and of non-being, non-esse. I begin by saying that Eriugena is probably known for two most original claims or ideas in history. First is the fourfold division of nature, the quadriformis divisio, which is unique in Eriugena, although there may be some parallels in Marius Victorinus and Augustine, but that particular way of breaking down the division of nature into four forms or species is unique to him. What is also unique to him is the definition of nature, or universalis natura, as he calls it, universal nature, as including not only ea quae sunt, the things that are, but also ea quae non sunt, the things that are not. And in so doing, Eriugena gives us a concept of natura that includes, as he says, God and creation, Deus et creatura, he says in book 1. The third area that of novelty that I think one can find in Eriugena is the idea that this nature goes from a hiddenness to a manifestation. And in so doing, God, as it were, creates himself. He says that in book 3. That is, he appears in theophanies. Creation in another means appearing in theophanies. And Eriugena says in book 3 also that creation ex nihilo means creation ex deo, that the nihil from which God creates is not something external to him, but rather is his own super essential goodness, which because of its superabundance lies in darkness. And we actually had a quotation in Mark Zier's paper that says something similar. So, and then something that's really radical in Eriugena, and that no one quite says before him, is that God can be understood as nihil, that one of the names of God is nihil. And that there, and he goes on to explicate this concept of nihil or non-being in 5 modes, in these quinque modi that he introduces in book 1, but he doesn't quite ever cash out afterwards, but continues occasionally to refer to different modes of being and non-being. And if I have time, I'll go through them at the end of this presentation. Just to start, and I'm sorry these are rather detailed slides, but I will share them afterwards with anyone who wants them. Eriugena says that the, if you like, the highest ontological difference, the primordialis differentia, is between those things that are and those things that are not. And this phrase, ea quae sunt and ea quae non sunt, or omnia quae sunt and quae non sunt, appears so often in Eriugena, it can really be seen as an identifying marker for his work. Eriugena found the phrase already in Maximus, And there is, of course, already a source in Marius Victorinus, but we don't know whether Eriugena knew Marius Victorinus directly, although Gustavo Piemonte suggests that he did. And I'll give you a reference. There's a reference there at the bottom of the screen, but I will give it to you again. One of the fascinating things about the Periphyseon is that there is a section in the middle of Book 3, a very extensive discussion of the meaning of nothing that various people, including Jonot and Capoins, have called a Tractatus de Nihilo, a treatise on the meaning of nothingness. And it is in the chapter titles that were added to the manuscript, you see De Quali Nihilo Fecit Deus Omnia. And this discussion begins when the student, alumnus, asks Nutritor, what is meant by understanding the name nothing? So he says here in this quotation from Book 3, but when I hear or say that the divine goodness created all things out of nothing, I do not understand what is signified by that name nothing. Whether the privation of all essence, or substance or accident, or the excellence of the divine superessentiality. And here you get the two major ways of interpreting nothingness. Nothingness understood as the privation of all being, the sort of Aristotelian understanding of nothingness, and then this, what I will call Dionysian understanding of nothingness as being superessential nothingness, that which goes beyond being, the hyperousios of Plato. So what are the sources of this notion of God as non-being? Well, Eriugena thinks directly of Dionysius the Areopagite, but he also at various points in the Periphyseon cites Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus Confessor as also holding this view. And he is also aware of, and this is something that I think makes Eriugena a very interesting reader of Western Latin metaphysics, he finds references to both negative theology and to the understanding of God as beyond being and non-being in St. Augustine, in Boethius's theological tractates, and he refers also elsewhere in to grammatical meaning of nothing, which possibly is a reference to Alcuin. I've put in brackets there Marius Victorinus and Fridegisus of Tours, because Fridegisus of Tours, who's more or less a contemporary of Eriugena, wrote a tract called De Nihilo et Tenebris. And it was a regular topic of discussion from St. Augustine's De Magistro onwards to discuss what is meant by, if you like, the nothingness or the darkness from which God created the world. And there's quite a number of grammatical discussions of this in Eriugena and others. But one of the most extraordinary things that Eriugena does, which goes beyond his sources, although it has a kind of anchor point in Dionysius, is to claim that there is scriptural authority for the use of the word nihil as a divine name, that God may officially be known by the name nothingness. And he writes this in Periphyseon Book 3, in the middle of this discussion on nothingness. He writes, and he's here invoking this notion of affirmative and negative theology. For according to the rules of theology, the power of negation is stronger than that of affirmation for investigating the sublimity and incomprehensibility of the divine nature. And anyone who looks into it closely will not be surprised that often, sepe, in the scriptures, God himself is called by the name nothing. Now, of course, that's actually not the case, as we know, but Eriugena thinks that it is not just rarely, but often that the name nothing is applied to God. And what he's thinking of is probably these kinds of passages one finds, and he quotes in the Dionysius Areopagites, the mystical theology. God is, for example, neither of the non-beings nor of the beings. Uk titon, uk onton, ude titon, onton estin, which Eriugena renders as that God is not among the omne non-ens et ens. He's neither one of each of the every thing or non-thing. And so you get that reference that God is somehow neither a thing nor a non-thing, and therefore is a different kind of entity and nothingness. And so here we have the translation of the divine names from Dionysius in Eriugena, as rendered in English by Sheldon Williams. And Eriugena quotes very extensively from the divine names. Indeed, he doesn't write a commentary on it, as Mark Zier pointed out, but you could take that quite a bit of the Periphyseon is a commentary on the divine names. And there's long quotations, and I'm not sufficiently expert to know whether this translation differs from the version that he does in the Corpus Dionysiae version, but or whether he amended it. But here you see he writes, quoting Dionysius's divine names, book 1, chapter 1, paragraphs 1 to 2, and the essence which is beyond all essence, the super essentialis essentia, existing after such a manner as do none of the things that exist, and while causing the being of all things, is yet itself not an on, and he quotes the Greek, ipse autem non on, for it is the summit of all being. Therefore, as has been said concerning this super essential and hidden divinity, one must not dare to say or even to understand anything except the thing that has been divinely expressed to us. For this is the way in which has been transmitted the most excellent revelation of itself in the oracles. That quotation from Dionysius' divine names suggests that this notion of God as being, not being, or beyond all being is already found in the divine scriptures, and that's what licenses Eriugena to say this. Elsewhere, Eriugena cites what he calls Gregory Theologus, Gregory the theologian, Gregory Nazianzus, and Maximus Confessor's Ambigua for the claim that God is alone that which is super ipsum esse proprie subsisted, that he alone exists above all being. Eriugena, generally speaking, and this would be a wider discussion, has a very interesting account of the, what you might call the Platonic forms, goodness, beauty, and so on, and follows the Platonic tradition of thinking of the good as being before being or beyond being. So regularly he defines God as the super essential supreme good, or the super essential and supernatural divine goodness, because of the divine excellence and incomprehensible infinity. There are a number of quotations from book 1. But what he means by super essential here is emphasized very strongly as meaning the negation of essence. For when it is said God is super essential, nothing other can be understood than that the negation of essence, he writes at the beginning of Periphyseon. And indeed, going later, right to the end of the book, in the 5th book of the Periphyseon, Eriugena is talking about the return, and he says all things will return unto him, who on account of the super essentiality of his nature is called non-being. So the reason why God is non-being is because of the super essentiality of his nature, not because of his defect or lack, or because of nihil per privatione. Eriugena says this very often. So in the expositiones in hierarchiam celestem, the expositions on the celestial hierarchy of Dionysius, he writes, "We believe that God made all things from nothing. What must be understood by this, if not perhaps that this nothing is he who, being exalted as super essential above all things and glorified beyond every word and every thought, is called not without reason nothing through excellence, nihil per excellentiam, since he cannot be any of the things, since he cannot be in any way any one of the things in the category of the things that are." And of course, elsewhere you'll see Eriugena saying that God is not also in the categories of the things that are not. So the kind of non-being he has is beyond all the things that are and are not. Here's an interesting remark that Eriugena makes after he has quoted a large section from Dionysius's On the Divine Names, he says, God, for whatever negation you make of him will be a true negation, but not every affirmation you make will be a true affirmation. For if you show he is this or that, you can be proven wrong, for he is none of the existing things that can be spoken of or understood. But if you declare he is not this nor that nor anything, nec hoc, nec illud, nec ullum ille est, you will be seen to speak the truth, for he is none of the things that are or of those that are not. So there you have the phrase that God is not only none of the things that are, which is a fairly standard claim, but also none of the things that are not. So that's actually quite a challenge that Eriugena, and his way of answering that will be to bring in these different modes of speaking about being and non-being. But let me just go a little bit to some of the source for this, and a suggested source for this claim that God is beyond the things that are and the things that are not is Marius Victorinus. This has been suggested by Gustavo, the Argentinian Eriugena expert, Gustavo Piemonte, in a number of articles, and I have references at the end of my PowerPoint here. Marius Victorinus, in his letter to Candidus, says that God is above all things, above all the existence and the non-existence. And he introduces this fourfold distinction, which some people think is the source of Eriugena's distinction in the four division of nature. What therefore in fact is God, if he is certainly not one of these, neither the truly existence, nor the existence, nor the not truly non-existence, nor the non-existence? For God produced these, so he is the cause of them. It is sacrilegious, however, to say that God is among the truly non-existence. That would be the Periphyseon. Necessarily, we say then, through superiority and preeminence, per prelationem et per eminentiam, he is above ton on ton, the existence. God is above all existence, above all life, all knowledge, and above every on or existent. And the ontos onta. Indeed, he is unknowable, infinite, invisible, without idea, insubstantial, inconceivable. And because transcendent, he is nothing of existence. And because he is above existence, he has nothing from existence. God is therefore me on. So that's probably the closest you'll get in the Latin tradition to the exact claim in Eriugena that God can be described as nihil, or in this case, he uses the phrase me on. That's the Latin there. I'll skip over it now in view of the time. And Marius Victorinus also has the same idea that we find both in Augustine and in Dionysius, that God is better known by not knowing. So in the letter to Candidus, the Arian, Marius writes, what, however, is this to me on, above to on? He is that which is known neither as on nor as me on, but as knowable in ignorance, since he is simultaneously on and not on, who by his own power has produced and led to on into manifestation. So, and led to on into manifestation. So here you have this idea very close to Eriugena, almost identical actually, that God, the divine nihil or meon, to meon, is not the same as either the regular non-being or the regular being. All beings owe their cause to the divine being, but so also do the non-beings. And indeed, alongside the divisions that we saw earlier, Marius Victorinus has a fourfold set of modes of non-being. And some people suggest, well, Piemonte has studied this carefully, that it is a sort of source, possible source, for Eriugena's fivefold division of being and non-being. And so we go again to the ad condidum, where Victorinus posits that which is not, id quod non est, into four modes, according to negation, according to being other than another nature, something you'll find in Nicholas of Cusa, according to what is not yet and what is futural and can be. This is probably based on St. Augustine, that neither that the future is not, because it hasn't come to be, past is not. And then the fourth one, according to that which is above all the things that are, super omnia quae sunt. So there are, if you like, four kinds of non-being in Eriugena, in Marius, and they are echoed by the 5 modes of being and non-being in Eriugena. Just a note here, you may have noticed this when I was reading it, that Marius does not use the Eriugenian formulation nihil per excellentiam. He uses rather what we saw, nihil per prelationem et per eminentiam. So there isn't an exact verbal parallel, but certainly the thought is very close. Now, of course, they're both drawing on porphyry. When I say both, Marius Victorinus is drawing heavily on porphyry, as Pierado and others have shown, but Dionysius is drawing more on Proclus. But this late Neoplatonic thinking of the one as a kind of non-being beyond being is echoing in the background of both these thinkers. So if I have 5 minutes left, I think, Niklaus, do I have 5 minutes? You're muted, so I can't hear you.
On mute. Yeah, 3-4 minutes.
3-4 minutes. Okay, enough time. Very briefly then. This is just a quick survey of the 5 modes of being and non-being in Eriugena. These are introduced in the right immediately after the fourfold division of nature, and it was one of the themes of my book in 1989 to claim that these are, if you like, a major ontological, if you like, contribution by Eriugena, in that Eriugena relativizes the framework of being and non-being, so that depending on which theoria we are operating with, we can understand things as either being or non-being. Werner Bayer-Waltes cites Eriugena's use of the phrase duplex theoria, but there is also, and I found it in Eriugena, the phrase multiplex theoria. So the idea is that there are different theoriae or contemplationes by which we can understand nature. And the first and highest, he says, primus ac summus, is where we first of all think that things that fall within the senses and the intellect can be said to be, but those things that because of the excellence of their nature surpass the senses and the reason and the intellect can be said not to be, for which the examples are God and the primary causes. So there we have the notion that non-being is non-being through excellence above the sensory and intellectual realm. The second mode, Eriugena says, applies only within the created order and does not apply to God. Things can be said to be or not to be, depending on where they are found in the hierarchy of creatures. And he writes, for an affirmation concerning the lower is a negation concerning the higher. He will give examples of this. Thus the affirmation man while still in this mortal state, is the negation of angel, while the negation of man is the affirmation of angel. For if man is a rational, mortal, risible animal, then an angel is certainly not a rational animal, nor mortal, nor risible. Likewise, if an angel is an essential intellectual motion about God and the causes of things, then man is certainly not an essential intellectual motion. So on this second level, there's a kind of hierarchy, wherefore if we focus on one level of nature, then the one above it and below it actually can be said not to be. The third mode is very similar to what Aristotle would have in terms of things that are actual and potential. Eriugena says those things that are actual can be said to be, but those things that are, as he says, wrapped up in the secret folds of nature, that is, things that have not yet come to be, are said not to be. So those things that already are and are visibly manifest are said to be, but while those that are yet hidden, though destined to be, are said not to be. And you could think there of the futural type of things that Marius Victorinus mentions here. The fourth, I'll skip to the fourth mode, which is probably one that appears regularly throughout the Periphyseon, and it's the opposite of the first one. in the first mode, sensible and intellectual things are said to be, and those that transcend the senses and the intellect are said not to be. In the fourth mode, only those things which are intellectual or intelligible are said to be, whereas those things that are caught up in change and mutability are said not to be. And Sheldon Williams notes here that the language is very close to Plato's Timaeus in the Latin translation of Chalcidius. And Eriugena is using a version of this mode, which he says comes from the philosophy. So he does acknowledge its source as in the Platonic tradition. Finally, the fifth mode, Eriugena says, applies only to human nature. And he contrasts here the difference between things that are in a state of grace and things that are in a fallen state. So he gives the example of human nature, which he says deservedly lost its being and said is not to be when it fell into sin, but restored by the grace of God is brought back to its former condition and begins to be. It is in this mode, it says, that the apostle refers to what he says, and he calls the things that are not as the things that are. Very important phrase from Romans that Eriugena uses. So that's my survey of Eriugena's discussion of being and non-being, and his very original claim that God is non-being. I put up here for further reading the sources, Edouard Journeau, Gustavo Piemonte, and then there are many interesting discussions in Bernard McGinn, Marcia Kolish, Donald Duclos, and others. So thank you very much. Thank you. And I will stop sharing now.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation, which gives me, as dealing with Eckhart so much, a lot to think again about this connection and conversation between these two. I think we go to the next presentation instantly, and then I hope we have some time for questions, or a few moments for questions at least. So Willemien, very quickly, Willemien Otten, professor of theology and history of Christianity at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She has been the president of the Society for the Promotion of Eriugenian Studies since 2011. Publications include, I just mentioned maybe two, the Eriugena, the Anthropology of the Honest Scotus Eriugena, 1991, and then just very recently, I think this month or last month, Thinking Nature and the Nature of Thinking from Eriugena to Emerson, just appeared from Stanford University Press. And Willemien will speak about Eriugena's Periphyseon as an exercise in thinking nature. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for at the Medieval Academy for making this possible. Lisa, Fagan Davis, and Maureen Miller, and Catherine Bryan O'Keefe. But also a special shout out to Mark Zier, who organized kind of the session. So I'm very grateful for that as well. So I have three sections in the paper which deals with and focuses on the Periphyseon as an exercise in thinking nature. The first is on Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist, then a little bit on Augustine, which is why I call him the last patristic cosmologist, and then on the exercise in thinking nature. So beginning with Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist. According to a well-known label coined by Jean Mabillon, Bernard of Clairvaux is called the last of the fathers, an honorific that appears to be based on his virtuoso Latin style that, since it did not seem to fit into any of the conventional genres, exegetical or homiletic, raised him to the status of a church father with an authority of near biblical proportions. Not based on style, but rather on the content of his thought, I've argued in a recent paper at the Oxford Patristics Conference that will be forthcoming in Studia Patristica, that there is much to be said for calling Eriugena, in a similar analogy, the last patristic cosmologist. One ostensible reason for making this statement is that Eriugena's texts hark back to the days of not only Origen of Alexandria, but also to Gregory of Nyssa, Dionysius, and especially Maximus the Confessor. Origen's Periarchon on first principles is close to Eriugena's Periphyseon on nature, not only in its title, but even more in its majestic proportions and monumental vision, which was made clear by Eriugena's modern editor and one of the founding members of Spes, I should say, Edouard Journaud, in what turned out to be actually Journaud's last published article. Eriugena also translated Gregory of Nyssa's early treatise on the making of man, which he called the Sermo de Imagine, and quoted liberally in Periphyseon Book 4. His translations of Dionysius the Areopagite, especially his mystical theology, and his commentary on the celestial hierarchy are perhaps the better known, though we should not forget that according to Eriugena, it is Maximus who made him really understand Dionysius. Standing in this venerable cosmological tradition, it appears as if Eriugena displays more affinity with Eastern than with Western authors. This may be linked in part to his own repeated statements that he has higher regard for the Greek tradition, as he sees the Greeks as allegorical exegetes and generally as more astute thinkers. And indeed, the cosmologies of Augustine and before him Ambrose are much more closely tied to the biblical hermeneutical context of their commentaries on Genesis, displaying a focus within them on the hexaemeron, the 6 days of creation, and rarely erupt into a more speculative mode. And yet it is on this last point of the hexaemeron that Eriugena displays a particular affinity with a Western Ambrose and Augustine, and the atypical Eastern thinker, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa's brother, whose Latin translations of his homilies on the hexaemeron Eriugena uses extensively at the end of Book 3. The question of whether Eriugena is primarily to be seen as a Greek or a Latin thinker has taken up considerable scholarly attention over the years. Since the impressionistic but apt image of Frederick Copleston that Eriugena's Periphyseon is a rock rising up from a plain, there has been the sense that he does not or can organically fit with his Carolingian environment. Since factors of intellectual milieu could apparently not enlighten his work, the interest has understandably shifted to tracing his roots, a problem that seemed all the more relevant because the Periphyseon, unlike other Carolingian texts, such as Theodulf of Orleans' Libri Carolini, is a patchwork in which we can find long patristic quotations interspersed with the author's own ingenious insights. Yet in the end, my characterization of Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist has more to do with an attempt to grasp his originality than that it is a means to adjudicate the question about his Eastern versus his Western sources or allegiances. Similar to Mabillon's characterization of Bernard as the last of the fathers, the gist of my labeling of Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist is to put him as someone transcending his age in collegial intellectual company that he otherwise appears to lack. I do so with the added qualification that I see Eriugena as a fully medieval, particularly a Carolingian thinker, much of which has to do with his textual preference for a patchwork approach and a predisposition to engage in dialectics and controversy, both of which characterize the texture of Carolingian writing and thought more broadly, even if they do not quite exhaust the remarkable project that we find in the Periphyseon. So now my next section on Eriugena's proximity to Augustine's exegesis of creation. To segue now into my topic of the Periphyseon as an exercise in thinking nature, let me briefly state with whom of the fathers I consider Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist to be in close proximity. And I'm actually showing some slides here. This is the slide that Mark also had of Eriugena and the real 5-pound note. But I wanted to go to my book, Thinking Nature and the Nature of Thinking, because I'm using some insights from it. So working here with some analytical insights I developed in my recent study, Thinking Nature and the Nature of Thinking, from Eriugena to Emerson, I hold this to be Augustine. Odd as this may be, for he is not a Greek but a Latin thinker, and also not a champion of allegorical exegesis, which Eriugena generally prefers, a closer analysis seems to make Eriugena's Periphyseon a fitting early medieval capstone to Augustine's oeuvre, for which it in some way supplies a missing piece. My view has everything to do with nature being the central focus of Eriugena's Periphyseon, which is Greek for on natures. It cannot be emphasized enough, and I'm saying that in the spirit, I think, of Edouard Junot, that on natures should henceforth replace the older but partial title on the division of nature, which has incorrectly been used for the entire work. But the connection with Augustine will also help us better appreciate the Periphyseon's unusual two-partite structure. The powerful first part, known for its two divisions into being and non-being, as Dermot just explained, followed by the fourfold division into forms of nature, ranging from God as creator back to God as the end goal of creation's return, but also for its analysis of Aristotle's categories and its discussion of the dialectics of affirmative and negative theology, culminates in the analysis of nihil, nothingness, in the middle of Periphyseon 3. It is followed by a second part, which is highly exegetical and then goes through the rest of book 3 and the entirety of book 4 and 5. What is unusual about the Periphyseon's exegetical part is that it is not expressive of an underlying ascetic program, as is often the case in medieval thought, whether we want to think here of Gregory the Great or the aforementioned Bernard of Clairvaux. Rather, the exegetical part, far from being epiphenomenal to another more substantive philosophical line of thought, continues the same arc of procession and return that begins with the introductory divisions of nature. It is noteworthy that division is also the first term of the fourfold set of principal parts of philosophy that Eriugena launches in her early on predestination. And I'm not going to read the entire text, but you find it on the screen. Divisoria, or diaretike in Greek, is there accompanied by the other parts called in Latin, respectively, definitiva, demonstrativa, and resolutiva. As the last term of this set, resolutiva, poses as another term for return, further clarifying that Eriugena collapses the pair of procession and return with that of division and analysis, and that the ontological arc and the methodological one of the work thus run in tandem. This clearly puts added weight on the exegetical part, making it from a biblical coda to an essentially dialectical manual, which was a very early view that Sheldon Williams held actually about the work, to a work that is deeply defined by its hybrid dialectical exegetical nature, which is the view that I would propose. The aspect of the Periphyseon's hybrid nature points to a missing link, if I may call it so, in Augustine's own work. If we survey Augustine's entire oeuvre, it's interesting to note that he has authored a book about the self, Confessions, that he has authored a book about God, on the Trinity, but that he has not written a treatise on nature or the cosmos. Here, Augustine clearly departs from the Eastern Eriugenian tradition, which allowed for so much cosmological speculation in a Platonic vein. While there's no question that Augustine ought to be similarly seen as a Christian Platonic thinker, it is worth observing that he apparently elects not to engage nature or creation other than through the writing of biblical commentaries. And in a chapter in my book, actually, I deal more extensively with that. In other words, where Origen may have erred on the side of too much speculation, it is as if Augustine redresses the situation by limiting himself to cosmological speculation through exegesis alone. As is well known, Augustine wrote many commentaries on Genesis, culminating in his De Genesi ad Litteram, which also focuses on the hexaemeron. My argument to see Eriugena as the last patristic cosmologist rests ultimately on the fact that I see him with the Periphyseon compose the natural theology that Augustine never wrote. Compose is indeed the right verb here, since Eriugena's Periphyseon is indeed a hybrid work. One part of that monumental work on nature is an hexaemeron commentary, which in its slow pace follows most closely in the footsteps of Augustine's De Genesi ad Litteram, from whom Eriugena quotes, while the hybrid nature of the work itself makes it indeed a fitting capstone to the oeuvre of Augustine, which seems to have been left open-ended precisely on that point. Of course, the major question is how to characterize this project of natural theology within my stated parameters as characteristic of Eriugena's, not Augustine's view. Clearly, one major difference is Eriugena's choice not to be content with biblical exegesis alone, but to engage in freer speculation, not only through the discussion of dialectics of Aristotle's categories and a substantive analysis of affirmative and negative theology, but also actually, as Dermot mentioned, of theophany, but especially through organizing his work as freely as he does, moving from procession to return as his philosophical goalposts, but doing so in rather meandering or zigzagging fashion by means of a discourse that has all the traits of Carolingian school dialogues. In trying to characterize Eriugena's work to non-specialists, and do note that even among medievalists, the Periphyseon is still rather avoided than read, and the foundation and ongoing work of Spes through its many conferences over the years can in large part be seen as an attempt to end Eriugena's splendid isolation, I have come to characterize the work as an attempt of what I call to think nature. Let me briefly explain why this is my chosen rubric and proceed by making 3 points organized around 3 foundational passages from the Periphyseon that show us what analyzing him through this rubric may yield by way of deeper insight into the work. So now the third and last session, Eriugena's Periphyseon as an exercise in thinking nature. Using the idea of thinking nature, which I do all throughout the book, as my rubric of choice for the Periphyseon and the Carolingian project it represents, allows me to approach Eriugena's natural thought as a creative, dynamic construct that is situated between 2 extremes that have defined the theological and to some extent also the philosophical discussion of nature in the West, namely pantheism and creation from nothing. Inadequately defined by either, but irrepressibly bookended by both, the Periphyseon is still more often than not seen as transgressing conventional orthodoxy. This is no doubt related to its condemnation by Honorius III in 1225 on the suspicion of pantheism, a judgment post factum, which has retroactively cast Eriugena as a heterodox and perhaps Gnostic thinker. Part of my reason for seeing him as the last patristic cosmologist is to show that the focus on the hexaemeron was quite common in early Christianity, and that Eriugena's fit with that tradition deserves to be taken much more seriously than it has been. What I want to make clear by seeing him as engaged in thinking nature is that Eriugena, for whom nature is a central category for all of reality, but is at the same time deeply related to the individual natures, including the creators in the hexaemeron, is keen on encountering nature in thought. I mean to create a distinction here between thinking nature as the encounter with nature in thought and thinking about nature, which involves rational reflection aimed at instrumentalizing nature for other purposes, such as using it for humanity's benefit. Thinking nature, in other words, respects nature's otherness, which Eriugena does in my view throughout the Periphyseon, and which he bases in part on the fact that God is seen as interior to nature. This leads me to the first foundational passage, which is taken from the Periphyseon's opening sentence, where we find Eriugena not define, but in accordance with the fourfold method from On Divine Predestination, rather evoke or conjure it up by dividing it into being and non-being. Since Eriugena makes clear that nature comprises both being and non-being, and defines non-being in Dionysian terms as that which transcends being understood by the human mind, the conclusion is inevitable that God is to be seen as non-being, even if that leaves non-being still an essential part of nature. Ergo, God must be included in nature. And this is the relevant passage, especially the first sentence. Often as I ponder and investigate to the best of my ability with ever greater care the fact that the first and foremost division of all things that can either be perceived by the mind or transcends its grasp is into things that are and things that are not. A general name for all these things suggests itself, which is physis in Greek or natura in Latin. And the student can only agree, for nothing at all can occur in our thoughts that could fall outside this name. It should be clear from the above passage that the concept of nature that Eriugena conjures up here is very different from Augustine's creation, which does not include the divine. Rather than seeing him stray into unorthodoxy here, however, he walks a fine line by seeing God indeed as interior and even integral to nature, but by seeing God at the same time as an essential part of nature that cannot be understood and not be domesticated, if you will. God, as I see it, God is co-opted to vouchsafe and boost Eriugena's respect for the otherness of nature. From here, I will move directly to the second foundational passage. It stems from the beginning of book 4, which is roughly the beginning of the return. Eriugena actually announces in book 4 that now he's on the path of return. Where Eriugena embarks on his hexaemeron, he's done some of that in book 3 with quoting Basil, but really does it in book 4. And it involves another major difference with Augustine, namely the role of the Eriugenian self that is doing the thinking of nature. I pay quite some attention to selfhood in the book, since you need a thinking self to think nature, and the difference with Augustine. I should say that this is probably my favorite passage from the Periphyseon, and I'll just read a part of it, or just highlight a few things as you can read along. The first is this: spreading sail then and set out to sea. For reason, not inexperienced in these waters, fearing neither the threats of the waves nor divagations, not the certes nor the rocks, shall speed our course. Indeed, she finds it sweeter to exercise her skill in the hidden straits of the ocean of divinity than idly to bask in smooth and open waters where she cannot display her power. And then the second one is to this Adamic image that is not so prevalent here, but I want to tease it out anyway here, but it's all over elsewhere in Eriugena. For in the sweat of her brow, it's here actually associated with reason, is she to get her bread, that is the word, so she's commanded, and to till the field of Holy Scripture, prolific as it is of thorns and thistles. And then it goes on to talk about the fall, and in the end, reaching it, she may love it, and loving it, she may abide in it, and abiding in it, she may here find rest. So it's anticipating the end of the return, if you will. This passage anticipates the final return of all things to God, and thus gives a foretaste of the 2 books of the Hexameron to come. It shows some other typical Eriugenian features as well, such as his predilection for a stormy sea over calm waters, as reason tries to steer its ship into a safe harbor. But the point I want to highlight is the role of the extra-paradisical Adam as the proxy for the Augustinian self here. One of the most difficult points to grapple with in the Periphyseon is how far we are from the intimacy of the Augustinian self. But instead of focusing only on the alienating effect that the externalization of the Eriugenian self as biblical Adam has on the reader, I want to foreground 2 other aspects that may be easy to overlook. The first is that the identification with Adam has a long history in Augustine as well, for whom Adam became truly the founding father of the human race, to the point that his own crises all seem to have a paradisical Adamic quality to them, be it the mindless theft of pears as an adolescent, or the crisis of conversion when under a tree in a garden he heard the command, pick up and read. The second point is a little more complex. Perhaps in part because Eriugena lacks Augustinian selfhood, he also appears considerably less burdened by original sin than Augustine was. This comes out at various moments in Periphyseon 4, where he deftly interprets the occurrence of Adam's sin in such a way that it does not really derail the progress that he needs to move his dialogue effectively from procession to return. What I want to point out here, however, is that his different take on Adam's fall does not indicate the absence of selfhood, but gives us a noticeably different sense of it. Whereas in Augustine, the fall marks the ultimate defeat of humanity, pushing Adam's offspring down to live life in a vale of tears, for Eriugena, life outside paradise appears as a fact. It is a more compromised life, for sure, as it is on the other side of the fall. But as such, it is a challenge to be seized, in that it is not marked by leisure, but inspires reason to do the best it can as it navigates its ship, the ship that is the Periphyseon, ashore. This subtle but crucially important difference with Augustine also throws a different light on the Periphyseon's opening passage, quoted just earlier, where nature is defined as comprising both being and non-being, God, yet God is seen as a part of nature that defies understanding. The concept of nature that Eriugena evokes and engages there is of nature as the sum total of reality, but a reality that is indeed on the other side of the fall, which makes the journey from procession to return not only an intellectual exercise, but makes it an exhilarating existential journey. Let me come to my final passage. This final passage is from the beginning of Periphyseon 5. I will give it to you, but I won't read it because I just actually have a final paragraph to end it. I'll just refer to it. I see this passage as essential to what I've called Eriugena's thinking nature. We have established that Eriugena has a sense of nature to which God is interior, but that he does not possess the kind of selfhood that yields Augustinian intimacy. Thus, there's not a sense in Eriugena that God is interior intimo meo, so to speak. Respect for the majestic contours of the work and respect for the alterity of nature it implies has led us, by contrast, to focus too much, in my view, on the structuring role of the Neoplatonic categories of procession and return, to which I've actually also referred, and I'm now going to take that back. They are indeed important, as I've shown, but they are also no more than guardrails, and it is nature itself that is in control of them, not the other way around. There has been considerable scholarship on the ingenious way in this regard in which Eriugena manages at the beginning of Book 5 to change procession into return. He does so by interpreting Adam's fall not as protology, but as eschatology, reading God's stern pronouncement that Adam not stretch out his hand and eat from the tree of life, instead as a promise, and seeing paradise hence as a situation that may come into being, but is not humanity's in humanity's past. That is indeed a remarkable move, but I do not think you can rest the interpretation of the entire meandering Periphyseon on the U-turn that Eriugena here makes. Hence my preference for this passage that is actually found in the same context, but what it shows is that all compassion has not dropped out. In fact, what I see Eriugena doing here, and more at large in his project of thinking nature, is to move compassion inside nature, seeing it as a natural, organic part or extension of it, if you will. It is the element of divine solidarity condensed here in the middle of the passage in the phrase, "I grieve for him," that makes the conversation here not one between master and student, but also between God and humanity, who are in this universe together, and while unequal, their mutual participation is needed for the universe to achieve its best. Also, instead of being extrapolated from nature, which may even be the case in Augustine to some extent, for Eriugena, salvation is fully found ensconced within nature. At no point does he invite us to climb a pathway to mystical union with the divine. He simply invites his readers, as he does here in a way, to learn from Adam and Eve by resuming their lives, but with a new awareness of the dynamism of their lives. From the sense of ownership that creates and fosters, the return then flows naturally. So let me end it here. Basically, I want to actually point out here and elsewhere that there are these sort of spaces that Eriugena creates, so to speak, in this massive text that show compassion, consolation, and that in a way show a way how to cope with reality at the other side of the fall. And that is actually what nature mostly signifies for him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Willemien. Thank you again, Mark. I should have said that at the beginning, who really is the instigator of this event, which also stands under the title of the Society for the Promotion of Eriugenian Studies at 50. I'm sure there's so much to talk about. It was wonderful also coming from the materiality and the philology and the preciseness of the textual moments through the speculation of about nothing into what in the end, and that's what something you mentioned, you said, it's not expressive of an underlying ascetical program, but in the end, in your last several sentences, actually, I found exactly that. Okay. That it is a somewhat contemplative ascetical program that is happening throughout the text. But I don't want to occupy the floor here, please. I think there was one question. I think you answered it most.
Niklaus, Nicholas, I just wanted to say we really only have a few minutes because we're already past
yeah.
the time and we have other sessions to prepare for. So if you could just maybe take 3 or 4 minutes to respond to questions, I'm sorry, and then we're going to need to end the meeting.
Okay, so I want to give the word to Dermot and Mark, I think, to if you have anything you would like to say.
Since I've unmuted, I'll just say very quickly, Willemien, that was wonderful. I really think that not enough attention has been made to the structure of the Periphyseon. You mentioned correctly that Sheldon Williams originally postulated an early treatise on dialectic, then the idea that it was meant to be 4 books, but extended to 5 books. Then the framework of the Reditus and the Exitus and Reditus, the Hexameron. But what I think you brought out most was the beautiful literary quality. And what you mentioned, I took down the notes about it, the idea that there's compassion inside nature. I just think that's an amazing idea. So I just want to thank you for all that. There's a lot to digest, but certainly this is great stuff. Thank you.
Yeah. Mark, did you or
I was about to say the same thing. That in fact, I was just reading that passage with my class the other day, and I think everybody was impressed that there is this. God is not this detached judge standing over things so much as someone who a being that is integrally and personally committed to making it all work, and to bring, and of course that's all, he gets a lot of that. The phrasing that he used in that last quotation that you gave is his own, I suspect. At least there aren't a whole lot of sources, but the sentiment is from his Greek sources, and I've been impressed again by how his whole theology is so much more positive than the typical Latin take in the West, and that he can see death as a really good thing, leading us back, this hyper positive view of being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. That reality only begins, in a sense, life only begins with once they're out of Eden and not in paradise.
I want just to add something. I recently in Suso read a passage and in Henry Suso about speculation and nature, where it led me back to the Victorines, and also not knowing that tradition well enough about suspicions about how Eriugena might have actually also been read in that way, very definitely along a kind of, I would call it a symbolic reading or moving symbolic reading was my more of a suspicion, but something I'm now gonna revisit in light of your comments.
Yeah, great.
So I have one quick question that somebody asked. So how does one join space?
Oh,
I go to the website, I'll answer this person in email. I have the same question myself. I should have done that a long time ago. It just brought it all back. So I'm very thankful to Mark to have this brought back to my mind also. In this
the simple thing is people can send an email to me. That might be easiest. There is now a new website of SPES, and I think it's spes-eriugena.org. I forget exactly. So you can find it there. We were hoping to have a conference September of this year in Salerno, but that is clearly not happening given the situation. So we're waiting to hear about a new conference, but that would be posted then on the website. And the SPES website also has a Facebook page, which you can like.
Yeah,
but at this moment, the administration is kind of in flux. We used to cash or try to get dues from people so that it would pay for the conference, but that's not how it works anymore. So everybody can join, everybody's welcome. And just send me an email and I'll forward it to the secretary of SPEST.
So I think before they throw us out here because they have to proceed, I just want to thank you all, and also it was like 37 participants who listened from all over the world. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for really 3 wonderful papers.